So, having listened to me wax on about the glories of 1999, you may be tempted to disbelieve everything I have to say about humans and the environment on the larger scale, which is good. You should be skeptical. You should be skeptical of my point of view. And I'll just say that it is my point of view. But I want to paint it in contrast to the segment from The Matrix that we just watched, in the sense that there's this idea that humans are inevitably terrible for the environment. We're a virus. We spread everywhere and multiply and take up all the natural resources, and thus we're a plague on the planet, which in Agent Smith's words, we have to be eliminated or contained by him. Not to have a spoiler for those of you who have not had the pleasure of watching Matrix 1. Things get bizarre in 2, 3, and 4, but Matrix 1 is probably still worth a watch. So I want to contrast that with a sort of a different picture that I hope is more accurate, or I hope is more optimistic for starting the second half of the semester. Maybe more optimistic. So the first thing that I would like to start with, and like I said, you should never trust my perspective, but I think this is correct, is that human beings began, humans, of course, all the cool stuff of human evolution happens in Africa. And from Africa, human beings expanded all over the world as we know it, all over the world, before there was any farming, before there was any agriculture, using a variety of hunting and gathering techniques that were adapted to various environments in very different ways, different social systems, all hunting and gathering, including some rather extreme places. Places that, well, Anaya, how extreme were they? In your paper, you wrote about danger zones. How extreme could we get? Yeah, what would you say the most extreme? The highest. I think you did the hottest, the coldest, and the highest. I mean, places where people wouldn't think people could make it in these places. I mean, sure, I guess having evolved in Africa, maybe humans are okay at the hottest, but to go from there all the way into the extremes of the Arctic or the extremes of the high altitude zones, it's incredible. Incredible what humans did. To say that these zones were even habitable by any standard imaginable is hard to believe. Incredible achievement, and again, all before anything resembling farming or technology. And in fact, we might say that in some places, or many, some or many, that the humans themselves made these places habitable. They planted things and cleared out things and burned things and did things so that the zones themselves became more habitable. Of course, adapted through the things you wrote about, the clothes and the housing, to these environments, using culture to adapt and really do something crazy good in the world. Now, some people get down on the humans and they say, well, the humans, everywhere they went, there were megafauna and the humans killed them all. A little bit. I mean, I don't know. Maybe, but just the big ones, the huge big ones that were like big snails anyway. They were like too big and slow to survive. We were too puny to kill all the megafauna, I would say. Again, this is my opinion. I think some people want to get down on humans for killing the megafauna, but I don't think we did. I think it was other factors. There was a lot of dramatic climate change during this time as well, and I think some of them just weren't around. I don't think we did it, but maybe we killed some of those big animals. In any case, in all of the zones that we went into, humans, whether they were hunting and gathering, or I might as well put in farming, have managed, transformed the resources in their environment. many different ways of doing this. We talked about using fire, different forms of fishing in the Arctic. About 15,000 years ago, 12,000, 10,000. Like I said, this is zooming way out. People develop a dependence upon, in various places, cultivated animals and crops, domestication, which was done in various places throughout the world. It was done in the Andes and in what is now Central America, Mexico, done, of course, in the Middle East, and as the Fertile Crescent in Asia and various parts of the world. People developed all kinds of different techniques to farm or have agriculture. Now, some people, like the people who believe that people killed all the megafauna and people are bad, believe that farming was the downfall of humanity. That once we started farming, you may remember from an intro class that you took with me, the article called "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race" by Jared Diamond, which talks to us about how agriculture did us all in, set us on the road to destruction. What do you think, Liz, when those Nile farmers in Egypt started doing their flood retreat farming irrigation, did they destroy everything? You would be correct. You would say no, and I would believe you. Yes. Very good farming they were doing there in Egypt. They were doing just fine with that farming and irrigation. Sure, they transformed the landscape, but it was not the downfall of the Egyptian world. Once they started farming, to do great things. What did we say, Cass? Is farming destroying all the soil all around the world? Every time you put a farm in, the soil goes to hell? Only sometimes, exactly. Only sometimes. And it does happen. You have to be careful anytime you're farming and on soil. You just have to be careful. But in terms of all the soil, no. So my feeling is that if you looked back 500 years ago to what we now call 1500 CE, or if somebody writes 1500 AD, you put sick. But anyway, it's basically the same thing. 1500 Common Era, or 500 years ago, as I like to put it. If you look back, surely there were some mistakes that people made. There were some environmental ups and downs. But really, if you looked across the world at that time, it was a pretty incredible panorama of human achievements, of irrigation, farming, pastoralism, hunting and gathering in various locations. Really quite amazing. That's why he titled his book, his textbook, Human Adaptability, because it really was a sort of tie-in, a sort of amazing feat that humans did. And so, as I've said, the reason I started with the Matrix is that I actually am very suspicious of people who go around and tell me about how all people are bad or people are naturally destructive of their environments. Because certainly, if you looked around up until about 500 years ago, I don't see it. I mean, every so often, yeah, somebody would screw up. Let's not say that nobody messed up. I mean, sure, some people messed up and did some bad things. It wasn't all beautiful, but on the whole, people were thriving and transforming their land in various ways and adapting to these crazy extreme environments. And again, I would say that beware the people who are going to blame this all on agriculture. Jared Diamonds of the world, who had told us that agriculture is the biggest mistake, because in fact people have been using agriculture and farming in various ways and all over the world for a long time and didn't have much of a problem with it. It wasn't a big deal. Sure, again, there were mistakes. There were people who overused the land or did things bad with it, but in general, it's not so bad. And one of the reasons I'm suspicious of people who do these kinds of things, one is it gets if you blame everything on the human species, it gets you out of things, right? Because then, well, everybody's doing it. I'm just going to drive this big truck down the road because, hey, we're all bad. So I might as well be badder than anybody else, right? So you can blame it on the human species, and then you're guilt-free, right? The human species, or we're all equally guilty. Or you can, if you blame it on agriculture, it also creates this kind of no-win situation, because it's like, what's the solution then? If agriculture is the downfall, what's the fix? Yeah, I mean, the fix is 99% of us have to go, right? We have to get back. We have to get back to about 1 million, 1 billion. I don't know. A lot of people would have to leave, right? So very not very nice to do that to people. Now, I'd like here to then, so in the geologists and sort of the environmental geologists have proposed that we are no longer living in the Holocene, that we are living in a new era called the Anthropocene. And there's all kinds of, who knows if this is ever going to be accepted as an official designation. But the people who have proposed that we live in the Anthropocene now say that we live in a new age in which humans are the biggest contributor, the biggest factor on the planet in terms of we see human effects everywhere. And people have debated various years and times for when the Anthropocene began. You might have heard of some of them. Some people say, well, it should be the Industrial Revolution. That's when you have this industry that spreads all over the planet. Others said, well, no, it should be the time of the atomic bomb and the atomic testing, which spread carbon and various radioactive materials all over the planet, messed us all up. Others have said, no, it should be farming. There's those farmers again. That's when humans started to control nature and going back to agriculture. So people have proposed various times for this. Like I said, who knows if this will ever be accepted as a real designation. But my personal favorite time for when we should start the Anthropocene is more or less 1610. And the people who have proposed this, you can look this up from the BBC and then read the article in Nature, have said that 1610 is the first year that we see a kind of, we can measure a human effect globally. Why, Autumn, did they choose the year 1610? What does that represent to us in terms of the paper you wrote? The heyday of colonialism. Yeah, I mean, maybe not the heyday of colonialism, but certainly a time in which the people were being transoceanically reconnected. And what the people who proposed the year 1610 say that you can see in that year the effects of the massive decline of the indigenous population to the Americas, along with the beginning of the transatlantic trade and enslaved Africans, along with the spread of crops from the Americas into the Eurasian world. So, it represents the kind of heyday of, or not the heyday again, the beginning, a midpoint, a crucial point in a different kind of epic. So from, I'm not a historian, I don't do years very well, 1500-ish to 1900-ish, in that range. What we see is a very different pattern. So again, 500 years ago, we saw people all over the world doing different things, not all of which were beautiful, but when we comes to around, by 1610, we can see that there's been a huge spread of disease and overworking and subjugation. I don't know what kind of words to use, but it was pretty bad. Lots and lots of people get wiped out in the Americas after the European conquest. one of the first things the Europeans did, or the Spaniards did for the most part, was to try and get the silver and the gold. Well, they first wanted gold. There wasn't a lot of gold. So but they did find some pretty huge silver deposits. I think I've told you about in other classes, in the mines of Potosi in what is now highland Bolivia. And they really, although the Spaniards didn't have a lot of industrial stuff going on throughout their empire, they did in the mines really take stuff out on what we might call industrial scale before there was an industrial revolution. The Spaniards didn't start really the plantation agriculture. That was a feature that was brought by more British, Portuguese, other Europeans into the Americas, but mainly to grow sugar, other crops, to coffee, tea. Once they had exhausted the indigenous labor supply, began what we might also consider a genocidal trade because of its effects in Africa, as well as the people who did not survive the journey, as well as the fact that the average person, African who was enslaved on a sugar plantation, was able to work there for 7 years before expiring. So it was a pretty harsh world, of course. We know something about that. Usually in this country, we learn about cotton, but sugar was the real mover for that. And as Louisa reminded us before, there's also been a cut down, a deforestation that had that happen. Now, at that point, or I mean, after that, so a lot of people know about the Industrial Revolution, but for me, it's crucial to realize how much it was built on a previous episode of extraction of precious metals, the production of sugarcane, which then fueled the working classes in England and France, able to provide the calories that they needed to keep working in those industries, and of course intensified all of these systems so that industrial agriculture becomes more prominent. So we have a very different situation going on here, which causes these kinds of global alterations that would go on for quite a while. But I think that after the Industrial Revolution, there was a belief that we could harness science and we could harness industry to bring development, often to the very places that people had just extracted all the resources from. Now we're going to bring in industrial development into places like Bolivia and other countries. And there was a shared idea, and what I mean by shared is that even the native peoples at the time believed that their way of life had either been destroyed or was about to be destroyed. And so up until, again, 1920s or so, there was this confidence that the West, European, North American science societies had figured out things, and that rightly or wrongly, they had been the winners, and that people who identified as indigenous or native were all about to go away. And so anthropology comes in to try and, rescue some stuff, dig up some artifacts before they all disappear, record some knowledge before it all goes away. Now, we come now to what happened from all this time and the situation we find ourselves in. Perhaps I'd say we're in that. I guess I would say that before we get to the environmental movement and the environmentalist critique, we should know that there was a long-standing critique coming from indigenous societies against what was happening to their societies by the Europeans. So they were not happy with this, and they often criticized the things that were going on. It's sort of been subdued, or we don't know about this. Liz and I are reading a book in my other class, which tells us that this indigenous critique also inspired a kind of internal critique. That is to say, people in European and North American societies who didn't like what was going on and sort of were fighting against the rapaciousness of the West. And the reason for the indigenous critique is that all those things that we see today, like deforestation or extractive mining or poisoning waters or dumping garbage on people, were first felt on indigenous lands, in these sites where people had tried to mine all the silver out, and on plantations, which really was a degrading form of agriculture. For the most part, though, this was not visible in what we might consider the heartland, the United States and European societies. This was something that was happening far away. However, the environmental issues did become increasingly visible in the United States. I was going to say the 1960s, but we might as well go back to 1930s and the Dust Bowl, right, Victoria? What happened there? Yeah, and something that I did not understand about this, but somehow you could like die from hugging somebody. Wild, huh? Yeah, guess you couldn't even shake hands. You might shock them to death. Anyway, so yeah, things got a little bit wild here. People realized that things were not good. Now, in the 1970s, films like Soylent Green and other weirdo environmentalist hippie types started warning us that there's this book called The Population Bomb, how the oceans were destroyed, how the pesticides were going to kill us all. And as Moran says, you know what? If we would have listened to those guys in the 1970s, things would have been easier to fix. We should have listened to those weirdo hippies back when they made Earth Day, like in 1971 or 1974. Like I said, I'm not a historian. Yeah, it's interesting to look back. Everybody's way into that back then. And I think I talked about this at the very beginning. I mean, there were some successes in terms of people had population control in various parts of the world, to the extent that in some countries they want to have more kids now because they feel like they don't have enough. People cleaned up their trash a little bit, at least got the bottle recycling, got all those bottles off the road, got that ozone layer back, and people were able to farm differently. But as we know, sadly, people kept driving around, CO2 emissions, cows, not doing enough, offloading garbage onto people, ever-growing population. And so now, as we read about Moran, and as you know from your everyday life, we seem to have more and more extreme events in all the climate zones. In the class before a break, Moran talks about preventable diseases, how a lot of these things were warned about, but we just didn't do enough. And then he says, or no, at the beginning he says that what we have is a clear and present danger to life on this planet that must be addressed now. All capitals. Sick. That's what he says. N-O-W in all caps. I think it's the only time that Moran gets excited in this whole book. Right? I mean, I've never seen him go all caps on us. I don't even think he ever has an exclamation point in his whole book. But here he says now in all caps. So he is getting a little excited here because
I guess that would be a good time to get excited if it's a clear and present danger to life on this planet. There's not what I expected. That's not what you expected him to look like? What do you expect him to look like? I thought he was going to be some sort of like trendy hipster kind of. What? Look at that sweater. A trendy hipster? What would give you that impression? Look. Emilio Moran was born in 1946. That looks great. Yeah, looking great. Well, I don't know when this photo was taken. Who knows? It is a good color. I mean, I could have shown it to you at various times of his life. Now, when somebody was born in 1946, what is the first thing you think? Prince Harriet. That's the first thing you think of. Yeah, they're all dead. They're all dead now. What do you mean? Oh, my poor dad. 1946. Oh, no. I hope he was another life. I mean, born in 1946. You're not even that old, guys. But you are classically what? Huh? Thank you, Autumn. This is the classic hey boomer, right? I mean, 1946 is the start of the baby boom. Yes, it is right after World War II. My dad, Emilio Moran, born 1946. I think the boomer, you have to be born up until 1964 is the end of the boomer generation. So he was a boomer. He's a little bit of a different kind of boomer because he's actually raised in Havana, Cuba. I guess now that I think about it, all right, so he was raised in Havana, Cuba before the Cuban Revolution. In fact, that's why he must have got out right before, because he went to high school in the United States and got his PhD in 1970. Right, yeah, he probably, I'm going to just imagine that he left right before Castro came to power. That would be around right? So he wouldn't have had to, yeah. Well, let's see. If you were born in 1946, you would have started college in 1962 to 66. Yeah, that would make sense. About right. 10 years to PhD. Sure. I mean, you might notice when he was coming of age, right? In that 1965 to 1975 era. His first studies were actually in the Amazon basin, in the Amazon rainforest area of Brazil. Mickey, he did do field work. He said he didn't do field work. He did a ton of field work. Emilio Moran did. He doesn't write about it in this book, because in this book, he's writing a textbook. The first edition of Human Adaptability came out in 1979. I don't know why. The only image I could get had a ruler by it, probably because they're trying to sell it on eBay, and so they have to make sure that it's 10 inches long. Liam, what's that guy? Huh? Yeah, what's he doing? Living. What would you say that this is representing to you? Like if you wrote a book called Human Adaptability, your first edition in 1979, and put a big Inuit guy doing, what does this say? Like, what does this image speak to us of? I would say, yeah, it's about the triumph of the human adaptability and spirit. And you have an Inuit guy, 1979. So he didn't come out with a second edition until 20 years later. The year 2000 comes out with a second edition. Yeah, serious font change, serious environmental change here too. What does this speak to you of?
I think it's the same. I think it's the same message. More native perspective, I guess, is the biggest, like, particularly these people making comments. So maybe he doesn't have to tell where the side.
Well, let's play with this a little bit. I like judging books by their covers, by the way. It's always fun. If 1979 was the triumph of the human spirit, would you say this is triumph of the human spirit?
Yes.
Hmm? I guess for me, I don't know. What do you see when you see somebody cruising through the rainforest? What does that speak to you of? I mean, the Inuit guy, man, he has to triumph over that. When you have in the year 2000, go back to when you were born, 20 years ago, think about what people were thinking about. 2000, before 9/11. I guess for me, I don't know about the thing on his back there exactly, but I'll just say that this is more like people living in harmony with nature kind of time, right? I mean, they're in the rainforest. It's all rainforest. It's harmony. It's listen to the indigenous people. Anyway, soon after that, he decided 2007, time to come out with a third edition. Yeah, he's getting faster. Then we have 1979, 2000, 2007. What's that? What does that image seem to say? Huh? He's on a cell phone. He's an African, I think I would say, African herder on a cell phone. What does that tell us? It says human adaptability, but in a particular way. It's not like the Inuit guy, and it's not like this guy. It's another guy, which tells us, what's that? Cultural connectivity, integrating the modern and the traditional, right? Using technology to still do herding. Yeah, we'll wait till you get to this one.
Migration.
Which he waited till 2022, another 15 years. I figure he had it figured out. Well, Jacob, what's this about? Yeah, how do you do this in the desert? They should be riding them. I know, but look at them. They're just walking along by the camels. I wonder why. Didn't read his paper. I think those camels are carrying things, though. I wonder if you can ride and carry at the same time.
Yeah, I think probably.
What does this image tell us? From your era. Everything else was from before. What does your era look like? You can see everything? Can you? It is an aerial. Oh, yeah, you're taking this from above. You're up above the people.
Someone on those camels actually very well be getting on to a ship that goes across the ocean that ends up in the target.
So is this an encouraging picture? Are you happy? You're not happy. I feel like there's a big shadow overwhelming us here. The people are being literally overshadowed by a looming cloud or something. They're in the darkness. And look how tiny those people are. Like, you really have to strain to even see if there's people in this picture, right? And as Jacob said, they should be riding the camels, but they have to walk alongside them in the desert. You know, the people are getting tinier and tinier, and the shadow is getting bigger. And maybe we've got a drone up there taking this picture for us, but man, it doesn't seem fun.
Side by side.
Yeah, the humans are getting very small. Yeah, Louis.
Say the third is kind of looks like that guy's on his cell phone.
Oh yeah, no, third is definitely cell phone integration of cell phones with herding. But yeah, now we're in a different funny world.
Do you have the other version of this book, or you only have the book?
I'd have to eBay them all, see? Go back and ask that person if they'll sell it to me. So, Moran is a scientist, right? In this book, his Human Adaptabilities book, he wrote 4 versions of it. And I think it's in the belief, and this comes through from his first studies in the Amazon basin, his belief that, if we just do the right science, then we could educate people, we could inform them, we could convince them. We're going to talk to the policymakers, we're going to talk to the public. If I just put out a new volume of this, it's really going to work. Students, if I make people read this and write about it, it'll work. Have an effect. In the last chapter, though, he gets funny. First, he gets excited, now, the big now in all caps. And then he tells us that, the epidemiologists told us the viruses were coming. Fauci had already had that map of all the viruses emerging around the world. And the climate scientists had already told us what was going to happen. And then he says, our response is always too little, too late. I know. What kind of a scientist says that? Really? Response is always too little, too late. It doesn't sound like a scientist. It sounds more like, what is that? Who's a Zeke? Help me. Fed up with everything. He's angry at, one way to read this is anger, right? It's always too little, too late.
I picture more of like a disappointment.
Yeah, I was thinking in the last class, I called him wistful, like longing for something, disillusioned. You could read it as anger, though. You definitely could read it as anger. It just depends what tone you want. There's another part where he says, COVID, we did a great job with the vaccines, but at the same time, it is discouraging to see individual countries largely failing to meet it with a unified public health response, or even wearing masks become contentious. So he seems sad, discouraged, wistful, disillusioned, probably pissed too, though, Zeke. You might be right. I think mostly sad. It just didn't work. And the ultimate reason, I think, this really got me. So he goes back to the eco-feminists. He says the eco-feminists argue. Now, let me just say, if you're in academia, if you were a textbook writer in academia, a guy who's written 4 editions of a textbook and is trying to sell it to people, and an eco-feminist comes along, what are you supposed to do? Huh? No. You do not understand academia at all. If an eco-feminist comes up to me, what am I supposed to do from my academic, all-knowing 4-edition textbook author perspective? I don't want to get thrown out of my professorship. Yeah, I mean, basically embracing ecofeminism, although I know you think professors are all way on the liberal side, but it's the kiss of death in academia. Like, you will be run out of this place if you embrace ecofeminism. So he should say, ecofeminists argue, but they're full of it because I wrote 4 textbooks. But no, he says, and perhaps with good reason. That's how you know he's like, oh man, I'm going to go agree with the ecofeminists. And why am I agreeing with the ecofeminists? That it's necessary to dismantle the entire culture of domination and hierarchy. Dude, I hope he is, I know he's retired. He is emeritus now, because once you start railing about dismantling the entire culture of domination and hierarchy, you better watch out for your own job, man, because they're coming for you. Anyway. Exactly. And here he's embracing it, man, perhaps with good reason. I know. Well, he says perhaps with good reason. Perhaps he's leaving a little bit open. Anyway. So. Moran has come on his arc. Yes, he's come on his story arc, and he's become very sympathetic toward even ecofeminism. He's become very sympathetic toward the indigenous position. He's wistful, he's sad, he's angry. He's gone through a lot. But in the ultimate instance, right, he is still writing his books about other people, right? This is a book about other people. Whereas Victoria, when we move into Hernandez, what is the difference between Moran and Hernandez? Moran's writing a book about, she is writing a book from the perspective of, as she put it, books by, right? So she says, hey, there's been a lot of books about us. Unfortunately, for many of us, there are many books written about us, but a few written by us. So, you know, there she is, coming in with a books by perspective. Moran, as some of you noted, is full of citations. I had the audio version of this Moran book, and it was like it was so painful to listen to, so many citations all in a row. Some of you did well following all these up in your papers, but boy, it's a lot of citations, right? I think, John, you even called him nitpicking.
Yes, very, and don't even know when it's weird because he goes on to like 5 different citations in one page, and then he makes rebuttal, and then you're like, oh, it's Moran, this is his book, and then he goes back into another one, and then he nitpicks about the credentials of other books that you don't really, like, you only mentions it within that short period of time, and he doesn't give like an excerpt of it. He kind of does, but then he just moves on. You're like, oh, what Moran quote next? What would
Oh, that reminds me, I forgot to query you about this. Another finding, kind of like electrifying people with their hands in the Dust Bowl. Remember when we were talking about that Arctic hysteria stuff? How the Inuit would go crazy, and maybe it was because they were peeing out all their calcium or some shit, or the days were too long, or the nights were too short, or the nights were too long, the days were too short. Right? Remember that? We remember Arctic hysteria, right? I mean, it's memorable. You weren't here? Oh, you weren't even here. Yeah, I think you asked about it, the imitative hysteria, all this stuff. What did you find, John?
I found that most of the studies were most of the causes of Arctic hysteria came from societal and hierarchical responses. They weren't typically from like, they were mostly like, most of the, well, I forget what they did, like, I forget what the term that they called it, but the American explorers often looked at them and they're like, boy, they're basically being bad American Canadians. Basically just putting bad behavior and putting that kind of having their false pretense of what their societal standards are and having that as the basis of observational study than rather than actually going down. In fact, actually didn't even know about one example about a woman screaming, or what they saw like a woman having an upset moment in the Inuit house, and they weren't sure if it was because of them coming over or it was the fact of the situation of what naturally happens in that environment without any so-called like American researchers coming in, because it's a lot more interconnected than just as simple as watching the Inuit people simply do a simple like theory routine. They had a lot more American experimental influence in it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that we all looked and, we're trying to figure out the biological reasons or the sunlight reasons or the social reasons. And it turns out that the most of the observations of this were under colonialism. And so a lot of it was a protest to what was going on at the time, observed by Euro-Americans in contact, and seems to have been a response to this hierarchical relationship, either perhaps within Inuit society or in relationship to the Europeans. And by the way, we should have known this by the term hysteria, because hysteria was used against whom to do all sorts of things in our own tradition in the 19th century. Victorian era hysteria accusations. Wait, who was accused of being hysterical? Women, right? I mean, it was, we should be very suspicious of transferring a term that didn't even make sense in our own society and was used to do all kinds of bad stuff to women, and to transfer it onto a society that we didn't even know anything about should have clued us in. Anyway, they were doing fine. Or they had their own problems. Anyway, Moran does a lot of citations, but he didn't cite that one, and that would have been a good one to cite. Autumn, what is Hernandez going to be bringing in here? How many citations have you read? None? I guess not, yeah. What's she going to draw on? All right, the old lived experience, which apparently her professors have been making fun of her and saying, aha, is that Jessica's theory? Anyway, try not to do that in this class. So we have that. Moran. Moran. From my point of view, Moran has no perspective at all. That's a weird thing to say. Cass, you found it out that Moran is Cuban American. How did you know that? You Googled him. You would not have known it from his book, though, right? Like, he could have put any name on here and you would have believed that it was, who knew anything about Moran? We didn't know what he looked like. We didn't see his baby picture. We didn't see him in sunglasses. We have no perspective at all. Now, we could say, Jacob, that is a wonderful thing, because what do we like our scientists to be? Objective, neutral. Don't have a perspective. Good job, Moran. Don't put your name on the book even. Just keep it off there. Don't even tell us your last name, because then we might get suspicious because you're a Cuban. Does he even have it? Oh yeah, he's Emilio F. Moran, buddy. Whereas Liz, where's Hernandez getting her perspective from? Yeah, she tells us about that a little bit, and her family and her dad, all kinds of things. Yeah, exactly. As we mentioned, Moran's audience is basically, policymakers, students, fellow academics. Anaya, who would you say the audience, or who is Hernandez writing for? Yeah, I mean, she is definitely writing as someone who is displaced and in a diaspora, but she's writing from, again, the perspective of the community. So it's not what I need to extract from you, but it's what myself as a community needs person is. She mentions that Moran, I don't know if he uses this phrase, but a lot of scientists do. They talk about indigenous people as having traditional ecological knowledge. She says she doesn't like that term, although you sometimes have to use it just to get people to pay attention, but she prefers the term indigenous science because the term traditional ecological knowledge sort of locks you in this mode of like, oh, you're a traditional person. You're not this, you have this knowledge which can be extracted, but it's sort of locked in time. It's not adaptable. And she wants to stress how indigenous science is adaptable and changing and a form of science, not just tradition. And so Moran, I mean, he says, again, he's very sympathetic, and I don't want to be mean to Moran, but at the end of the day, he's still talking about, well, we have a lot to learn from the indigenous people. And he's still sort of in this mode of kind of salvaging, getting the knowledge from people, getting indigenous knowledge. Whereas I think it's important to note, remember how I said around 100 years ago, we believed, actually everybody, we shared the belief both in indigenous communities and in non-indigenous communities that the indigenous communities were about to go away, that there would be no more, that they were going to all westernize. And one of the big surprises, I think, for many people over the last 30 or 40 years is that there has been a resurgence of indigenous people, indigenous movements, both politically, over issues like land. Like, who would imagine, remember the Standing Rock protests about inconceivable 70 years ago, right? That you would think that indigenous people would be having a national movement. Whatever you thought about it, it didn't seem to be possible a while ago. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that we would classify Moran in this country as a Latino, probably, if we saw him on the street, right? Or he might say that himself as a Cuban American. Now, whatever is problematic about the Latino identity, Mickey, what would Hernandez say about this identity? Yeah, and if she went to Mexico, or she does go to Mexico, what does she see as the classification system? What does she see as, should all Mexicans be Latinos or all Mexicans? Yeah, this is, I mean, I guess this is difficult for us. So if I didn't get it on the first go, I'd recommend reading this whole section over again on pages 8 to 10, where she talks about how, I mean, for one thing, yes, there's a lumping that Americans do of all Latinos into one group, right? So we put non-Latine people, put Latine groups into one, lumping together Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican into this one terminology, Hispanic. And she says, not only is that weird, but it's also weird if you are an indigenous person from Mexico or from El Salvador. Latino basically means whiteness, which is kind of hard for us to understand because here it is a term that is used to try and keep people out of the white category, whereas in many Latin American countries, you're kind of at the top if you are mestizo, blanco, etc. So again, it's a little bit difficult. If you didn't get that, check it out again. Moran says to us that we could have fixed this, as I said, in the 1970s. It would have been easier to fix if we would have listened to the hippies and the environmentalists and just done what they said. what does Hernandez think of the environmentalist movement?
I think it's a bit like excessive.
No. I mean, maybe in a certain way.
I got, and it has some backhanded words to say about it.
Oh, she's got some backhanded words, but on what grounds? Pass. Yeah, I think that's probably what I would use some of it. Right. I mean, she's saying that when environmentalism was established, and you can look back at the Sierra Club if you don't believe this, like, you know, those guys marching through nature and trying to clear out all the inhabitants. But certainly the idea is that environmentalism, as it was practiced, wanted to have some sort of communion between the environmentalists and nature and ignoring the people that were already there. And so for Hernandez, she doesn't think that the 1970s environmentalist movement would have solved our problems because, in fact, Western environmentalism won't save us. So you can read various reviews of this book. But this is one of the big points that she's making, is that you need to bring indigenous perspectives to the table, not simply a kind of technocratic, science-driven Western environmentalism.